not business as usual. It's creating new value in new ways through people working well together. It's only self-evidently superior if you've experienced it. And that's the issue, right? People don't believe in things unless they've experienced it. And if you can unlock that uniqueness individually and collectively, you're going to create more value and people are going to have more fun and more enjoyment.
People are accepting almost invariably of the fact that they are asked to and expected to behave as a cog in that particular machine. And therefore, that's just the price you pay for employment.
We give so much credit to the people who provide the finance, that those that actually do create value are getting squeezed out, in effect.
If you're in the high-tech sector, the innovative ideas come from the most junior people because they're the ones who are most familiar with the latest technology. And the immune response from the other parts of the organization would kill off the work that we'd been doing. And usually it would result in the senior person leaving.
The rules of the game are, don't innovate at all. Copy if you must.
If the consultants are coming in and doing the sense making and decision making for them, there's no new muscles developed in the client organization. And the board should turn to the CEO and say, oh, does that mean you're incompetent as a leadership team then, that you don't know what to do, so you're having to hire people in from outside to tell you what to do? We need people who are capable and creative to create real value in the world if we're going to transform the planet and be able to survive on it. What I'm focusing on is helping equip the people in the organization who aspire to be change catalysts, who aspire to embody the traits that are required.
Welcome to this episode of Work Punks. We have today a special guest, Geoff Marlow, who is particularly well known for his work creating innovative and agile organizations. And so I understand has particular thoughts about what's wrong with most organizations today. Before we dive into exactly what's wrong and what's right, Geoff, perhaps we can ask you to introduce yourself and we'll take it from there.
Right. Well, thank you, Paul and Ben and Colin for the invitation. I started out as an engineer doing electronic engineering and a particular interest in control systems. I did my degree with British Aerospace, the aerospace company, funny enough, at what was then a polytechnic, but is now a university in Coventry, centre of UK. When I chose my degree course, I'd heard this horror story of a guy who had got a first-class honours degree, and he turned up on his first day at work. And as usual, when you turn up your first day at work, the boss is on holiday, so he got sent down to the machine shop to be in the under the tender care of the shop manager, shop steward, whatever, down in the engineering shop, and just to get him used to what the firm did. And they made machine tools, whatever. So they got this guy and they said, look, we've got this machine in from a customer. We're going to fix it, give it a service and what have you. Perhaps you could take the inspection cover off. Gave him a 10mm spanner. Oh, it's probably 1/2" AF in those days. And he went along and he didn't know how to turn a spanner because he'd never actually picked up a spanner before, even though he got a first-class honours degree in mechanical engineering. And I was horrified at this, right? This idea that you could get an engineering degree and never have done any engineering, because I was always under cars from the age of about 12 onwards, holding the spanner, which was half AF in those days, on the other side when my dad was trying to fix the thing on the other side. And, my mum had decided that I could get under the car now rather than her. So I've always been kind of practical, and it's always been, my focus has always been what works. And what I saw when I worked at British Aerospace, and then I moved to the BBC in engineering for a year. That didn't work out. And my sister, who was a physics teacher at the time, sent me an advert that was at the back of New Scientist magazine for a company here in Cambridge called Cambridge Consultants, which is probably the best way to describe it these days is an open innovation lab. So it's a place that applies science and engineering and technology to help people solve business challenges. And it was great. And it was like I used to say to people, having joined the firm and moved to Cambridge, which was 40 years ago last year, that it was like having died and gone to heaven. And it took me a number of years to unpack this. But what I realized is both the British Aerospace and BBC were both typical top-down hierarchical command and control organisations, and Cambridge Consultants wasn't. And it reminded me actually of my early experiences at school, where the school that I went to was experimenting with pupil-centric learning. There'd been a big report done by somebody called Plowden, the Plowden report, not surprisingly. And my school was one that was experimenting with what happens to kids if you create the conditions for them to flourish. And it worked really well for me. And they ran out of things to teach me. I ended up putting up shelves in the school library for the last 3 months because they'd run out of stuff that they could give me to do that was of an academic bent. So I passed my 11 plus, which was in those days the examination that got you into grammar school. I went to the boys' grammar school, which was 2 bus journeys the other side, on the posh side of Coventry. I lived at the rough end of Coventry. To King Henry VIII School, so called because it was founded in 1545 by one of King Henry VIII's ministers for raising fine Christian gentlemen. So and this was like literally going to hell, having been in heaven, going to hell. It was like there was a place that thought they knew how to turn you into what they thought you should be, which was completely different to my schooling up to that point from the age of 7 to 11. So when I turned up to Cambridge Consultants in 1983, it's like, oh my God, I didn't really put the pieces together at that time, but in reflecting on it later, what I realized was I'm back in an environment like that. And their philosophy was, we create the conditions for you to flourish, because if you flourish, the business will flourish and we'll grow and we'll make money and everyone will have a great time doing it. So that was the kind of the deep learning. So while I was at Cambridge Consultants, I was doing digital systems design, electronics, real-time control software. Did that for a couple of years. I'm sort of like, well, the technology stuff's okay. But what was really interesting was as you manage teams and as I got promoted to run a group of people, it's like when you're looking at 2 CVs for people you might recruit, you look at the CVs side by side and it's like, well, these people look pretty identical. And you hire both of them because you're on a hiring spree. And one of them turns out to be 10 times more innovative, 10 times more a team player, 10 times more customer focused. On the other one, it's like, well, what's going on there? And how come they behave differently on different days? Like some days this person's more dynamic and other days they're not. So I got fascinated in the human side of this, like what is it that creates the conditions in which people doing technical stuff, so you're dealing with the laws of physics. It's not like you're in marketing where you can just make shit up and wave your arms around and put it out there and somebody will kind of buy it probably. You're dealing with the laws of physics, so it's a bit like Scotty on the Enterprise. You kind change the laws of physics, Captain. You've got to make things that actually work, but people have to come together to do that. So that was kind of like the fascination for me became, well, how do you do that? And then one day a client said, Geoff, we like working with your people a lot more than our people. You couldn't come and make our people behave more like your people, could you? And I was kind of already having this pull towards the human side of innovation. And so that was the request probably about 1988, something like that. So about 35 years ago. And that got me onto the path I've been on ever since, which is helping organizations try and create cultures that have more of the innovative, agile, adaptive. Somewhere in there'll be some connection point with people understanding, it's not business as usual. It's creating new value in new ways through people working well together.
I've known you for about 3 years now, Geoff, maybe 4 years coming on.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize, I had a very similar experience to yours of what I call the playground and the prison. So that when I started work, the first half of my career was in a playground and the second half was in a prison. And you can guess which one was the hierarchical command and control one. And it's funny, so we're sort of energized by the same contrasting experiences. And I think that's sometimes why we get exasperated and struggle to understand why people are still locked into the one that's so bad. When the one that's good, whether you call that the playground or heaven, is so self-evidently superior. in so many different
the
ways.
thing is, it's only self-evidently superior if you've experienced it, and that's the issue, right? You know, people don't believe in things unless they've experienced it, and most people haven't experienced it, so they go, "What's this? What's Colin on today? You know, what's he smoking? Crikey, me, you know."
That has been said about me before. Yeah.
I didn't know pirates had a reputation for smoking illicit substance, drinking lots of rum, yes, but
Yeah.
I think most people will probably have experienced it, but they don't not in a corporate environment, not in a working environment where things matter more or where people get paid for stuff. And therefore, to make the connection that actually what you enjoy in your team sport or in your knitting club or whatever it is, where actually things work really, really well by people coordinating themselves and finding out what really fires them up, to transplant that onto their working environment is anathema to them. Why do you think that is, Geoff? Do you have a view of that?
Well, I think that probably the overriding driver of why we've ended up in the situation we have with organizations being the way they are is, I mean, you go back to the Enlightenment if you want to. In the late 1600s, the whole idea, I mean, particularly, I'm going to have to blame a Cambridge guy now, Newton, and the whole clockwork universe thing. The idea that you could describe things as machines and as mechanisms really captured the mood, and it did enable people to do things. The whole scientific revolution came about because of it, and the power of science and technology has emerged because of that kind of way of thinking that has then led to the Industrial Revolution, led to corporate institutions, organizations, producing goods and services. And that thinking has been around for so long, that 1911 was Frederick Winslow Taylor's book, The Scientific Management, which really was, and he was like a rock star of his day. It was the Elon Musk, probably a bad choice, but anyway, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, somebody of that stature anyway, who actually maybe Elon Musk might be a good analogy. Actually, I think about it, because apparently Taylor was, I think these days we call them OCD, don't we? It used to be called anal retentive, but he used to go out when it was playtime or recess, I think they call it in America. The kids would go out and he'd spend the whole of recess measuring out the baseball pitch that they were going to play on. So by the time that they got to actually play baseball, they had to go back in and get on with their lessons in the afternoon. So yeah, being on the spectrum is probably something that kind of came through all of that. But yeah, I mean, we've modeled organizations on machines, and with machines, what do? You design them. So organizations get designed. That means people get force fit into roles that the machine needs, rather than people being looked at as living beings with their own uniqueness, that if you can somehow unlock, as my school did and as the Innovation Lab did, if you can unlock that uniqueness individually and collectively, you're going to create more value, and people are going to have more fun and more enjoyment and all of that sort of thing. So yeah, I think very much you can, if you wanted to pin it down to one thing, you'd pin it down to the thinking about organizations and machines that you can trace all the way back at least to the Enlightenment, and probably you can arguably go back to Aristotle, but I think the Enlightenment's a good place to start.
And by implication, are you saying that people are accepting almost invariably of the fact that they are asked to and expected to behave as a cog in that particular machine, and therefore that's just the price you pay for employment? I
think probably up until maybe 20 years ago, very, very few people would have questioned the logic that you've just crisply articulated. In more recent times, people have probably been a little bit more, why would I want to work like that? And perhaps younger people today would be looking and saying, well, is that really what I want to be doing for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years? And questioning that thinking, and it's also reinforced by the fact that you have an HR function, which HR really was there to mop up the bits that were not machine-like about humans. You try and fit them into machines, but then there's sort of bits that refuse to be fit into, we have an HR function to deal with those soft, fluffy things and whatever. And then you realise actually, well, you need your people to be a bit more creative. So we better train them a bit. So we'll get some trainers in and do some training. But it was always like a bolt-on, add-on function to the primary mission, which was to run an efficient machine with high productivity, maximum efficiency, and I have people performing roles where they're interchangeable, because if one of the people breaks, you don't want to spend too much time trying to fix them. You just want to get them out the door and plug another one in that's broadly the same shape or can be made to fit the same shape. So a lot of performance management, a lot of stuff around recruitment, job descriptions, all this sort of stuff all comes out of that thinking. And of course, everything reinforces everything else. So you've then got the metrics that people come up with to measure the performance, then drive people to behave in certain ways where they know that it isn't the best way to behave, but if they want to get the brownie points and they want to get the goodies, they've got to score well on the metrics. And so this whole idea that what gets measured gets managed. I prefer what gets measured gets manipulated, because as soon as you say to somebody, you get more beans if you score high on this metric here, people will find out a way to score high on the metric. And in doing that, they then lose their focus on actually doing what would be useful to actually really create real value. And then you say to people, we actually want you to be innovative and agile and adaptive and create real value in the world. And people go, well, yeah, I hear you saying that. And I'll nod sagely when you say that in front of me, because I don't want you to fire me. But on the other hand, I know I get rewarded for doing this other thing over here. So I'll say that, but I'll actually do this instead. So a lot of the dysfunction that you get in organizations stems directly from, you've got this deeply, deeply, deeply embedded machine paradigm that is underpinning the structures and the ways of behaving, how things are measured, how things are rewarded. And not just in organizations, but in the wrapper around organizations. So one of the firms that's here in Cambridge, very, very innovative company called ARM, designs all the chips that go into our mobile phones and things. If you go in there, what you'll find is that for 3 weeks of the quarter, wonderfully innovative, agile and adaptive. And then, you'll find for 2 months of the quarter, 2.5 months of the quarter, it's like that. And then when it gets near the reporting period, Dr. Jekyll goes away and Mr. Hyde comes out, and everybody's nose to the grindstone to hit the targets. And then they hit the targets, and then everybody's like this for a week afterwards. And then it goes back to being innovative, agile, and adaptive. And that's not inherently due to the culture of the company. It's due to the fact that it's in a context where people have to hit targets because that's the expectation placed on it by the market in which it's operating. So we've got all of that to shift if we want to get organizations to be really creating real value in the world. And by value, I don't just mean money. I mean, things that we need, like not destroying the planet, being able to survive, thrive, people doing things that they find meaningful, all the things that you guys talk about on your channel.
Story about ARM, it's almost as if that context they're in, which is all about the finance and the legal requirements and all that sort of thing, is almost a tax on their innovative abilities. And maybe, well, I think part of the problem is that we actually, over the past few decades, certainly in our working life, the emphasis has been moved away from that innovation and creativity and much more onto the financial side, which is, so now that has an overbearing influence on how organizations are, what they're there for, basically. I mean, they're so focused on, and we give so much credit to the people who, provide the finance, that those that actually do create value are getting squeezed out, in effect.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly saw that at the BBC, because when I joined the BBC in '82, that's 40 years ago, it still had an engineering function, obviously, because I joined the engineering function, and it still did a lot of its own design and development work. And then gradually what started to happen is there were companies producing broadcast equipment. So you bought your cameras and you bought your vision mixers and you bought your studio equipment and stuff. And so the guys in the BBC engineering function ended up being like box shifters, you bolt stuff together to make something work. and then somebody in accounting. I think John Burt was an ex-McKinsey guy, ended up being the Director General of the BBC. You know, they come up with this, oh, well, we don't actually need these folks. We can actually outsource all of this. You know, we don't actually have to have these people on the payroll. So you do end up moving towards a more of a transactional relationship. You know, the organization doesn't have its own drive and innovation and vibrancy anymore. So that certainly happens. But a lot of my early experience, so both as an engineer, but then as a consultant doing work in cultures of innovation, was for companies that were doing stuff that was high tech. And one of the things that when I started to get involved with organizations that weren't like that, you know, often banks and financial institutions and stuff, you realize that they were quite different beasts in the sense that what the thing that was always, again, you know, you only notice this after a number of years of working, you look back on it and you go, why are they like that? Oh, okay, that's why they're like that and they're like that. And the difference is that if you're in the high tech sector, the innovative ideas come from the most junior people because they're the ones who are most familiar with the latest technology. And in traditional organizations, the big ideas and the big decisions always got made by senior people. In the high tech, obviously senior people had to be involved in making decisions because you can't just have random decisions going off all over the place. But they always understood that the ideas and the clever stuff was going to come from people who were doing the new novel technical work. And so they created cultures where the ability to make sense of something and make decisions and take action was kind of baked into the relationships between people in the organization. Whereas in traditional organizations that didn't have that innovative driver, you didn't require the youngest people in the organization to really be listened to because they weren't the ones really coming up with the ideas. In fact, the people coming up with the ideas were usually the consultants that you were hiring in from outside to tell you what you should do next. So you kind of had this ability for senior people to become very distant from the people who were really creating the value in the organization. And then, you know, with that idea that you're a machine and you've got certain people who are governing and running the machine, and then as you got IT coming in to help separate the senior people from the great unwashed who are actually working on the shop floor, and you could abstract what they were doing into data that gets presented on somebody's balanced scorecard dashboard. You know, you get all of this distancing of the human connections within organizations, which you couldn't have in high tech, because if you did, they would very quickly be out innovated by somebody else, and they were, you know, and they would go to the wall. So I was lucky in a way to see a lot of the high tech, or see a lot of firms who are working in high tech, and recognize there was this pattern where you didn't get the kind of management that you got in traditional organizations. And so one of the big challenges that banks and financial services have faced over the last, say, 10 years or so is everybody wants a sexy app for their smartphone. And yet the IT people within the banking sector don't do sexy, smart, innovative things. What they do is they bolt everything down to make sure nobody can hack in the back door and steal money. And they make sure it's all compliant with Sarbanes-Oxley and all of the legislation and all this kind of stuff. And so suddenly the marketing person rocks into the IT department and says, we want you to design an app. And it's like, what's that? So then they go off and hire an external agency called Purple Banana or something like that, with folks turn up with orange hair and sandals, and they design this app, and then they throw it at their IT people and say, plug that into our databases, and the IT people tear all their hair out because there's no way they're going to bolt something on that they haven't been involved in designing, because it's not going to comply with all of the, you know. So banking has had a big disruption in the last 10 years or so as they've tried to respond using capabilities that they didn't really have, because their IT was really about pouring concrete around everything and making sure it never changed.
So that explains often why large established organizations that grew up in very different eras and perhaps with different drivers are far from the most innovative and agile organizations that you would find today. You work with some of those organizations to try and make them more innovative, agile, adaptive, as you said yourself. So there's two questions that provokes with me. One is, A, is that even possible? And B, how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, it's possible, but there's a side effect to it, and it's something that's taken me most of my career to notice this, because so I was working at the Innovation Lab here, Cambridge Consultants. At the time, it was owned by Arthur D. Little, one of the sort of mid-sized management consulting firms. And one of the practices in ADL that was Arthur D. Little that was a bit different to most consultancies was they had what they called the Technology and Innovation Management practice. The guy who ran that Technology and Innovation Management practice, the TIM practice, often was asked by, or occasionally, not often, was asked by clients, look, we need to be a bit more innovative. Can you get our people to be more innovative? And so he would bring in people from Cambridge Consultants who could talk about the technologies that we were developing and working with. But then he got wind of what I was doing, which was in response to his clients saying, can you come and make our people behave more like your people? So I got sucked into lots of assignments with ADL clients to do this kind of work. And what I found was that if you could find somebody, usually chief technology officer or a business unit head of new product development, who really saw the need for innovative behavior within the organization, you could get quite a lot of traction within the part of the organization that individual influenced. What then happened was other parts of the organization started to see this as an alien being, and the immune response from the other parts of the organization would kill off the work that we'd been doing. And usually it would result in the senior person leaving and probably becoming an independent coach or consultant. And this is one of the defense mechanisms organizations have. It's like when anyone tries to do anything really innovative and adaptive and agile, the immune system makes it very, very difficult for them. They've got super inspired by, talking to folks like us, and I could do something like that in my organization. And they try, and the organization pushes back, and they get ejected. And that's one of the ways that organizations manage to keep themselves in a form of stasis that stops them from being able to change. So it took me a long time to realize that actually a much better way of doing this is you identify people across the organization who have a propensity to operate in this kind of way, who are like change catalysts, people who embody the way of being that is about being more innovative, agile, and adaptive. And you help them to form an internal network where they mutually support each other in doing stuff that's kind of below the radar, that actually results in change in the organization. I mean, it's got echoes of Colin's sort of pirate kind of mentality, where things get better without anyone coming in blowing trumpets and saying, we're going to do the wonderful XYZ change program. And everyone thinks, shit, is that going to affect me? How's that going to affect me? And, all the defenses go up. So a lot better to actually get traction in different parts of the organization. And then hopefully at some point it coalesces into a whole system change, more like a kind of a viral effect. Again, this is back to the underlying metaphor, with the underlying metaphor of machine. It's like, well, how do we scale this? That's the question people ask. Well, how do you scale a virus? What you do is you infect people with it, and then it scales itself. So it's a very different way of thinking. But yeah, big, large organizations have major issues trying to shift because of all the, the embedded legacy thinking, there's always one best way to do things. We just need to go and ask the consulting firm what the one best way is. We need to do all or nothing. It's got to be soup to nuts. It's got to, there's various deeply ingrained metaphors and concepts and axioms that are there under the surface in organizations that most organizations don't notice are there because it's the way it is.
And that applies to this desire, if and when it exists and comes to the fore, with organizations wanting to be realizing perhaps that they are quite inert and need to become more nimble, but they apply that same thinking to that desire as well, don't they? Oh, we want to be like X. How do they do that? Well, let's create something that's a carbon copy or very similar, and let's implement that.
We want to be innovative and unique, so let's copy somebody else who does this.
Yeah,
totally. That reminds me of a conversation I had with a lady working with one of the biggest police forces in the country, at an event that I was part of, and I'd said a few things up on the stage, and she came along and had a chat with me afterwards, and she introduced herself. So I'm a civilian. I work for this police service, and my job title is and I'm pretty sure her job title had innovation in the in her, that was explicit in her role. And she said, well, I really love the story that you, and I took a client along with us, and we told a little story about the work we'd done, which was all very iterative, emergent, an exploration into the unknown. She said, well, yeah, that sounds great. She said, but I could never, ever do that in my current place of work. And I said, oh, why is that? She said, well, we're not allowed to do anything that we can't demonstrate there is another police force in the UK already doing with a track record of success. So there you are. There's the tension in just one sentence. That was an explicit part of our job description, was innovation. And yet the rules of the game are don't innovate at all. Copy if you must. Best practice, one best way. What works in one police force is bound to work in another, completely different context, completely different bunch of people, etc., etc. And yeah, I've never forgotten it. I just felt so sorry for her. She was really excited about this role, and we'd had this great day. It was Cranfield, and lots of great speakers. She's really fired up, and then she's really, oh yeah, well, I can't do anything that isn't already being, it isn't being done anywhere, isn't being done by another police force in this country. It's very sad.
So you write in your work about the role that especially big consultancies play in this, but also that sometimes they do have a positive role to play.
Well, they did, yeah.
So can you explain and where does it tip over into destructive roles?
Yeah. So if you look at how consulting came about, it was basically, well, in fact, Arthur D. Little was the first management consultancy, founded in 1886, although I don't think it was incorporated till about 1903. And I mean, McKinsey's 1926, so they're coming up for 100 years. And the idea was to advise senior people on markets, technologies, these kind of things, which you couldn't get access to information on. It was very difficult before the internet to get access on these, access to data and insights on these things. And so what would typically happen is a client would say, look, we're thinking of moving into this particular market, or we want an acquisition in this particular area. Can you advise us on who to acquire or how to enter a particular market? And the consultants would go away, they'd do some market analysis, they'd look at competitors, they'd look at what they could glean about the strategy of competitors, and they'd come up with some advice that was well-informed, data-based, that would be used by senior people to make decisions, strategic decisions about what to do. And that was really, helpful for them at that time. But of course, as the internet came along, you could get more access to this information yourself. You could Google it, or you could join Gartner or, Conference Board or any of these data aggregator businesses that pull stuff together, and they could have some guys in the back room, help you do your reports, and you didn't need to pay millions and millions and millions of dollars to hire a consulting firm. But the consulting firms existed, and they've got, mouths to feed, their shareholders to satisfy. And so the business model that they'd evolved, which in the trade is known as the finders, minders, grinders model. So the senior people go out and find clients, the few mid-level people manage assignments, and lots of junior people grind away 80-hour weeks, whatever, for 5-6 years until they're burnt out, and then they're ejected from the organization. And of course, if you're doing lots of data processing and analysis, you can do that. You can hire very bright people who've got zero experience, and they can do analysis, and then senior partners can massage the presentation and whatever and deliver it, and it kind of adds value. The problem comes when what the client organization needs is culture change. Because you only get culture change because people behave differently, and people behave differently when they do things differently, and they don't do things differently if they're not the ones doing the sense making, the decision making, and the action taking. if the consultants are coming in and doing the sense making and decision making for them, there's no new muscles developed in the client organization. They get developed in the consultancy, if at all. And so the organization doesn't change. So effectively what happens is you undermine the capacity of the organization to iterate this sense-making, decision-making, action-taking loop. And once you've undermined that, then the organization is impoverished in its ability to lead itself into the future in any way. Of course, then you become more dependent on the consultants. And of course, that's what the consultants want, because the senior executives want the consultant to come in and answer the questions because they don't know how to enable and empower their own people in their own organization. And the consultants need the senior people to hire them and their junior consultants because they've got a $5 million sales target. And the only way they're going to reach that is by selling large teams of junior consultants to senior people. So you have this kind of codependency between senior executives and consulting partners. And if you're a senior executive and you haven't got a clue what to do because your organization's facing competitive pressures and there's a dynamic, uncertain, unpredictable world, VUCA, whatever going on, you can either really try hard to transform your organization and get your people, unlock the capacity of your people collectively to innovate and iterate things, test, try, you can do all of that. Or you can blow millions of dollars of the organization's money hiring a consulting firm that will probably not result in anything useful for the organization, but will give you plausible deniability with the board. Which of those options are 90%, 95%, 99% of senior executives going to choose? So until that pattern is broken, and to me, the way that gets broken is by boards saying, what they say at the moment is, well, look, you're in a difficult situation here, and we're not really, we won't say this bit, but we're not really sure we trust you and the leadership team to know what to do. You better bring in McKinsey, Boston Consulting, KPMG, whatever, the names. That's what happens at the moment. What needs to happen in future is the CEO goes to the board and says, look, we're in this difficult situation and I want to hire consultancy XYZ. And the board should turn to the CEO and say, oh, does that mean you're incompetent as a leadership team then, that you don't know what to do, so you're having to hire people in from outside to tell you what to do? Now, if that was the response, then the whole of that massive industry of consulting, which sucks in people who would do really good jobs as senior people or just working in organizations, creating real value in the world, instead of working out how to parasitically suck money and the life out of organizations, institutions, and governments. Something's got to break that pattern. And I think that probably boards waking up to the fact that this is actually undermining the capacity of the organization to have a future, let alone thrive in the future. That's probably the leverage point at which you break the pattern. And it doesn't have to be broken very much before these big firms fall apart, because the billability requirements within consulting firms are so high that it's very marginal. Like you get an average billability of 52%, you're making money, 49%, you're bleeding red ink. It doesn't take much to undermine the capacity of the firm to keep itself afloat. So I would like to see that happen. I'd like to see all the people who would normally go into jobs in consulting go into proper jobs and actually do something useful with their capabilities for the world, rather than act as parasitic accelerants to the demise of organizations and society.
I agree with your analysis, Geoff, but I think there is muscle being built, but it's the muscle of resistance. In that, as you say, if the sense making and decision taking is being done externally and people just given actions, then they generally resist because they don't really want the change anyway. They get no benefit from it. It's just being rolled out over them, and that's, I think, a big reason why most of these big projects don't actually deliver what they're proposing, what they're supposed to. But that, I sense that muscle of resistance is getting stronger, and people are less and less likely to go along with this stuff. And we see that with the way people are shifting jobs much more frequently. The whole thing about quiet quitting, which is basically people saying, no, I'm not doing this bullshit anymore. I'm just going to do what I get paid for. These things, you know, are beginning to fatally undermine the performance of these companies. Because if you get things like high staff turnover, there's a real big hidden cost to that in terms of loss of productivity, loss of knowledge. You know, it's just not just the cost of recruiting people, but the interruption to the work patterns and everything. Companies can't sustain that indefinitely.
Yeah.
It will drag them down. So either boards will get wise to that and decide to take a different point of view, or, you know, companies will just shrivel up and die and new ones will take their place.
Yeah, and I mean the massive amount of human suffering, and you mentioned the next thing that goes on in organizations, and this is where I really first got my big exposure to one of the major, that was McKinsey. I mean, one of the big consulting firms. I was working with a client and I couldn't understand how he could possibly do his job. He was like 2 or 3 layers down from the really big beasts in this organization. And it seemed to me that McKinsey had been in and they'd done a redesign. And it seemed to me that what had happened is they'd created effectively a couple of tectonic plates that were either going like that or coming apart, right? Whatever. And there's this guy 3 levels down from anyone with any real clout whose job it was to keep these things in sync and aligned. And it was a Dutch guy, actually. I remember saying to him, Joost, his name was, I can't remember his surname. I remember this is going back a long time. It's going back 25 years. And I can remember saying to him, because I'm a great one for asking dumb questions. It's like, unless I haven't really understood your job, Joost, I don't see how you can possibly do your job. I mean, it seems to me that you're in an impossible position because you're 2 layers down and you've got these forces and you've got no control over it, but yet you're responsible and held accountable. I said, you know, if you don't mind me asking, how do you cope with the pressure? And he said, oh, that's easy, Geoff. He said, I have terminal cancer and I'll be dead in 9 months. And if I don't stick this out, my family won't get my pension.
Shit.
Wow. And I'm like, really? Somebody has designed an organization where there's a guy whose only positive light on the horizon is his death from cancer in 9 months, but having stuck it out so that his family gets his pension. You know, who these people think they are designing such absolute nonsense. I actually was really upset by this. I went back to my hotel room that evening and I sat on the bed and I cried like a baby. Like, you know, how could you possibly do something like that? And it, you know, it was so obvious that it wasn't going to work. So obvious that it wasn't going to work from a human perspective. And yet, you know, somebody shoveled millions of dollars into somebody's fees and they had it, you know. And that's going on all over the place, you know, the amount of human suffering where we need people who are capable and creative to create real value in the world if we're going to transform the planet and going to be able to survive on it. And yet all of this stuff going on, pushing it all in the other direction.
Mm. Yeah, and there are some good examples. I mean, some of the big companies that try to be more innovative and more people, planet, profit balance, like Unilever, for instance, they're the leaders that formed that agenda or set that agenda, have since been pushed out, right? So we don't necessarily see companies of that stature embracing this new world that we are hopeful about and optimistic about, but we need big players to adopt that and embrace it as well. Otherwise, I think if we are relying just on newcomers and startups to replace the old dinosaurs, which ultimately I'm sure they will, but will they do that in time? Can we rely on them to tilt the economic powers that are in place? I don't know.
That's why I think that for me, at least personally, and I'm not saying this is right for everybody, but for me personally, what I'm focusing on is helping equip the people in the organization who aspire to be change catalysts, who aspire to embody the traits that are required to do this kind of shift under the radar, you know, out of the, you know, without sticking their heads above the parapet, so that the organizations actually transform because people are doing useful stuff, almost like a rearguard action. in the organization. And I think it has to be that way. You know, it's in the world of physics, one of the quotes that I love is Max Planck, who was founding father of quantum physics. And he made the observation that new ideas in physics don't get adopted because they explain phenomena better. What happens is eventually their opponents die and they're replaced by people who've already grown up with a new theory.
Mm.
And for someone like myself who's been involved with the organizational learning movement, you know, worked with Sengi, you know, 1990, the fifth discipline came out. So that's 34 years ago now. So over 30 years, I think we're in a situation now where conversations that I have with people who are at the mid to senior level are already very familiar with these sorts of ideas, but they still find themselves operating in an environment that is discouraging towards them.
Mm.
And I think, you know, if I had to point to a hopeful trend, it would be that more people are already familiar with it. This thinking is not so alien. They just don't have much opportunity or as much opportunity to operate in alignment with it as maybe better for them, better for their organizations, and better for society in general.
Mm. I think that's a beautiful and hope-giving point to end our conversation on for today, I think, Geoff. Thank you hugely for your contribution today. It's been thought-provoking, stuffed with insights. So thanks again for contributing to today's session. And perhaps we need to schedule you for a follow-on, because I feel that there's lots more to debate with yourself and to learn from you. So thanks for joining us today. Thank you, viewers and listeners, for joining us for this episode. Watch this space for our next episode, and don't forget to like us, but more importantly, don't forget to check out the references and let us know what you thought about this debate and perhaps what our next debate should be all about. Bye, everybody.
Hooray!
Bye, guys.